AITAH for telling off a lady in a supermarket after she made the teenage cashier cry? Yesterday felt like any other day, until it wasn't. I was doing my usual weekly grocery shopping at the local supermarket. It's not exactly an exciting outing, but in the monotony of everyday life, even small tasks like this offer some kind of structure. The store was busy, the aisles crowded with people juggling their errands before the weekend. It was the typical scene. Families wrangling kids. People idly chatting as they pushed their carts. Everyone in a mild rush to get through the day's chores. As I moved through the aisles, tossing items into my cart with practiced efficiency, I found myself in a long checkout line. I wasn't in any real hurry, so I settled in for the wait. My cart parked behind an older woman, probably in her mid-50s. The line wasn't moving as quickly as anyone would have liked, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for a busy afternoon. That's when I noticed the cashier. She couldn't have been more than 17, clearly young and, from the look on her face, fairly new to the job. You could see the nervous energy in her movements. She fumbled with the scanner, her hands slightly shaking as she tried to keep the line moving. I've been there before, in those early jobs where every mistake feels like the end of the world. And you just hope no one notices. But someone always notices. The woman in front of me started to shift her weight, muttering under her breath. At first, it was just small gestures, tapping her foot, sighing dramatically every time the girl scanned an item. I could feel the tension building in her, like she was about to burst. The cashier accidentally scanned one item twice. And that's when it happened. The woman snapped. "How hard can it be to do this job?" she hissed. Loud enough for everyone around to hear. The cashier's face flushed instantly. She tried to apologize, calling for a supervisor to help void the extra scan. But the woman wasn't having it. "You can't even do basic tasks. You're wasting everyone's time." The girl fumbled with her words, apologizing again, but you could see she was unraveling. Her voice cracked, and her eyes were starting to well up. She kept glancing at the line behind her, probably feeling the weight of everyone's impatience. And the woman in front of me just kept going. Louder now, her voice dripping with condescension. It was a situation I've seen too many times. Someone taking out their frustration on a person who has no real power to defend themselves. I stood there, heart pounding, hoping the woman would stop, that someone else would step in. But no one did. I could see the cashier holding back tears, trying so hard to keep it together. And something inside me snapped. Without even thinking, I took a step forward and said, "You don't have the right to treat someone like that. She's doing her best, and it's just a mistake." The woman whipped her head around, her face twisted in shock. "Excuse me?" I didn't back down. I couldn't. "If you're so unhappy, maybe you should try working like her for a day and see how easy it is." For a split second, the woman looked stunned, like no one had ever called her out before. But she quickly recovered, narrowing her eyes at me. "You should mind your own business." I felt my hands clench around the handle of my cart. It is my business when you're making a kid cry over something as stupid as groceries. The woman stared at me, her face flushed with embarrassment, or maybe anger. She muttered something under her breath and then turned back to the cashier, who was now being helped by her supervisor. The older woman grabbed her bags, still muttering, and stormed off without another word. As she left, I felt a strange mix of relief and adrenaline. The kind you get after standing up for someone in a situation that feels wrong. The cashier, now visibly shaken, turned to me with teary eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was small, fragile. I nodded at her, trying to offer some reassurance. But there was a part of me that felt unsettled. I looked around the store, noticing for the first time the eyes of the other people in line. Some looked away, as if embarrassed by the scene, while others gave me a look that I couldn't quite place. Were they judging me? Or maybe they were just as uncomfortable as I was. It's funny how standing up for someone, even when it feels right, can still make you feel like you've done something wrong. The rest of my checkout went by in a blur. I could barely focus as I paid for my groceries, the encounter still fresh in my mind. As I walked to my car, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Had I overreacted? Was it my place to get involved? Maybe I should have stayed quiet. Let the situation play out on its own. I loaded the bags into my trunk, replaying the woman's words in my head. Mind your own business. The way she said it. Like I had intruded on something that wasn't my concern. But it was my concern. Wasn't it? When you see someone being mistreated, isn't it your responsibility to say something? Or did I just make things worse for everyone involved? Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about the look on the cashier's face, the way she tried to hold back her tears as the woman berated her over something so trivial. I kept wondering if I had really helped, or if I had just added to the chaos. I felt proud in the moment. Sure, but now, I wasn't so sure. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me with nothing but questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had done the wrong thing, even though it felt so right at the time. And that's when the doubt set in. The entire drive home, my mind replayed the incident in a loop, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The way that woman's voice dripped with disdain, the cashier's trembling hands, the raw tension of the moment. I felt the weight of it all. But now, without the heat of the moment, doubt began to creep in. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe stepping in wasn't the right thing after all. I sat down on my couch, groceries still in their bags on the floor, and exhaled deeply. Why couldn't I just let it go? I had stood up for someone who needed it, hadn't I? But the looks from the people in line, they stuck with me. It was as if their silent judgments had latched onto me, turning my certainty into doubt. Had I embarrassed the cashier more by getting involved? I started questioning everything, whether I'd truly helped or if I'd just made the situation worse. Maybe she would have preferred to deal with it herself. After all, the woman would have eventually left. The conflict would have resolved itself. Right? I grabbed my phone and absent-mindedly scrolled through social media, looking for something to distract me. But nothing worked. My mind kept circling back to the supermarket, like a dog chasing its tail. The truth is, I've never been someone who enjoys confrontation. Growing up, I was the quiet kid who avoided arguments, who ducked out of uncomfortable situations. I wasn't a hero swooping in to save the day. So, why had I felt the need to intervene this time? I thought back to earlier moments in my life where I'd witnessed things like this. Small moments of cruelty or impatience in public spaces. I've seen people snap at baristas over a wrong coffee order, or parents yell at their kids in the middle of a store. And I've always just watched. Uncomfortable but silent. There's something ingrained in us, I think, that tells us to mind our own business. Don't interfere. Don't escalate. Just let it play out. But yesterday, I didn't. I stepped in. Why? Why couldn't I just stay quiet? Let the situation pass like I always did? Maybe it was because I'd seen the way that woman treated the cashier, and it felt all too familiar. I knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of someone's impatience. Someone's bad day. When I was a teenager, I worked as a cashier at a fast food place. One summer, I spent long, grueling hours behind a counter, taking orders from people who saw me as little more than an obstacle between them and their burgers. There was one woman in particular who I could never forget. She came in every week, ordered the same thing, burger, no pickles, and every week, she found something to complain about. The fries were too cold. The burger had pickles. The line was too long. It didn't matter what it was. But every time, she would direct her frustration at me, like I had personally failed her. I wasn't just a kid trying to earn a little money for college. I was the person ruining her lunch. It was humiliating, and no matter how much I apologized or smiled politely, it never seemed to make a difference. I remember one particularly bad day when she raised her voice in front of a full line of customers, telling me I was incompetent and should find a job I could handle. The shame I felt in that moment stayed with me long after the incident. But what stung the most was that no one said anything. Not the other customers, not my manager, no one. They all just stood there, pretending not to notice, as if it wasn't happening. Maybe that's why I couldn't stay silent yesterday. Maybe I saw a bit of my younger self in that teenage cashier, trembling under the weight of someone else's anger. And maybe I didn't want her to feel as alone as I had felt all those years ago. But even now, as I tried to justify my actions, I still wasn't sure I'd done the right thing. Stepping in felt good in the moment. But what if I had embarrassed the cashier even more? What if she had wanted to handle it on her own? I kept imagining how she must have felt, standing there with tears in her eyes while a stranger stepped in to rescue her. Maybe my intervention only made her feel weaker, less in control of her own situation. I thought about the woman who had yelled at her, too. Sure, she had been rude and impatient. But what was her story? Was she just having a bad day? Was she going through something that made her snap at the wrong person at the wrong time? Maybe I had judged her too quickly, assuming she was just another entitled customer when in reality, she might have been struggling in ways I couldn't see. People don't always act like their best selves when they're hurting. Was I any better for jumping in and scolding her? As if I knew better? The truth is, none of us really know what's going on in someone else's life. It's easy to label people as good or bad in a moment. But life is rarely that simple. And now, sitting here in the quiet of my living room, I couldn't help but wonder if I had just added more negativity to a situation that didn't need it. I stood up and started unpacking the groceries, trying to busy my hands and quiet my mind. But the nagging questions wouldn't go away. Was I really standing up for someone else? Or was I just reacting out of my own past pain? Had I spoken up for the cashier? Or was I speaking up for my younger self, the one who had stayed silent for too long? As I put the last of the groceries away, I realized that I didn't have an answer. Maybe I never would. But what I did know was that yesterday had stirred something in me, something that wouldn't settle easily. I had always thought of myself as someone who avoids conflict, who keeps to themselves. But maybe there was more to it. Maybe, deep down, I had been carrying around a quiet anger, a frustration with the way people treat each other. And yesterday had been the tipping point. I didn't regret stepping in. But I couldn't ignore the doubt gnawing at me. Was it enough to stand up for someone? Or was there a better way to handle situations like this? Could I have diffused the tension without adding more to it? These were the kinds of questions that would keep me up at night. Replaying the moment in my head, wondering if I could have done something differently. I sat back down on the couch, the weight of the questions still heavy on my chest. I wanted to believe I had done the right thing. But right and wrong don't always fit neatly into the boxes we want them to. Sometimes, they blur together, leaving us to sift through the gray area in between. And that's exactly where I found myself, somewhere in the gray. Unsure if I was the hero of this story or just another person trying to feel good about themselves. The day after the supermarket incident, I returned to work, hoping to throw myself into my routine and shake off the lingering uncertainty. But as much as I tried to bury myself in tasks and emails, my mind kept drifting back to the scene with the cashier and the woman. It was like a pebble in my shoe, something small, but impossible to ignore. I work in an office, the kind of place where stress builds quietly. It's not a high-intensity environment on the surface. No one's shouting. No one's rushing, but there's an undercurrent of tension that we all feel. Deadlines, internal politics, and the constant pressure to perform hover over everything like a thick fog. I'd always thought I handled it pretty well. Sure, I had my stressful days. But I never thought of myself as someone who snapped under pressure. But yesterday's incident made me question that, too. How many times had I felt like that woman in the supermarket, impatient, frustrated, on the verge of losing it, without even realizing it? I had seen her as the villain in that scenario. But maybe I wasn't as different from her as I wanted to believe. The more I thought about it, the more I began to see parallels between my reaction in the supermarket and the way I handled stress at work. Take the project I'd been working on for the past few weeks. For example, it had been dragging on for what felt like forever, with constant revisions and new demands from my boss. Just last week, I'd found myself snapping at a colleague, someone junior to me, because they hadn't completed a task the way I'd asked. At the time, I told myself it was justified. They hadn't followed instructions, and I had a deadline to meet. But now, thinking about it through the lens of the supermarket incident, I began to wonder, was I any different from the woman berating the cashier? Sure, I didn't shout, I didn't make a scene. But my tone had been sharp, my patience thin. I remember seeing the look of discomfort on my colleague's face, the way they quietly apologized and tried to correct the mistake. I had felt a surge of irritation, like I didn't have time for their incompetence. And just like the woman in the supermarket, I had let that frustration spill out onto someone who was just trying to do their job. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at my computer screen. Was that who I was becoming? Someone who snapped at others when things didn't go perfectly. I'd always prided myself on being composed, calm under pressure, but now, I was starting to see cracks in that image I had of myself. Maybe I wasn't as patient or as understanding as I wanted to believe. There's something about work that brings out the worst in us sometimes. The stress, the deadlines, the feeling that there's always something else that needs to be done, it all adds up, slowly chipping away at our ability to empathize with others. I hadn't realized it until now, but I was carrying that stress around with me, letting it seep into my interactions with people without even noticing. As the day went on, I kept replaying moments in my head, small interactions I'd had with colleagues. Moments where I had been short with someone or where I had let my frustration show. Each time, I thought I had been justified. But was I really? Or was I just making excuses? The same way the woman in the supermarket had probably justified her outburst to herself? I thought about how easy it is to fall into that mindset, thinking that your problems are more important than everyone else's. That your frustrations give you the right to treat people poorly. It's a slippery slope. And it's one I hadn't realized I was on. That afternoon, a situation arose at work that put everything into perspective. A colleague from another department sent me an email asking for help with a project that wasn't technically my responsibility. I had a mountain of work to get through and no time to take on something extra. My initial reaction was frustration. Didn't they know how busy I was? Couldn't they handle it themselves? I could feel the irritation rising in me. That familiar sense of impatience bubbling to the surface. I was just about to type out a curt reply when I stopped myself. I thought about the cashier in the supermarket. About the way she had looked when the woman berated her. I thought about the junior colleague I had snapped at last week. And how I had made them feel small because I was too wrapped up in my own stress to show any understanding. I paused and took a deep breath. Maybe this colleague didn't know how busy I was. Maybe they were just as overwhelmed as I was. And they were reaching out for help because they genuinely needed it. Instead of firing off an annoyed response, I typed out a brief but kind message, explaining that I was swamped with my own workload but would try to help if I could find the time. It wasn't much, but it was a small shift, a conscious decision to be more understanding, more patient. The rest of the day passed without any major incidents. But that small interaction stuck with me. It reminded me of how easy it is to let our frustrations dictate our actions, especially in a high-pressure environment like work. But it also reminded me that we have the power to choose how we respond to those frustrations. I still wasn't sure how to feel about the supermarket incident. Part of me was glad I had stood up for the cashier. But another part of me wondered if there had been a better way to handle it. Maybe I had been too quick to judge the woman in line. Too eager to paint her as the villain in the story. But what I did know was that the incident had forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. I wasn't as patient as I thought I was. I wasn't as immune to stress and frustration as I liked to believe. And maybe that was okay. Maybe recognizing those flaws was the first step toward being better. As I left the office that evening, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't have all the answers yet. But I was starting to understand that empathy, real empathy, meant more than just standing up for someone when they were being mistreated. It meant practicing patience in my own life. In the small, everyday moments that often go unnoticed. It meant being kinder to my colleagues, to strangers, and to myself. Because, in the end, we're all just trying to get through the day, one task at a time. That evening, as I sat at home reflecting on the events of the past few days, my mind inevitably wandered to my family, especially my relationship with my mother. If I was being honest with myself, my impatience and my tendency to react to stress with frustration were habits I had learned early on. Growing up, the lessons about how to deal with stress, how to manage the pressures of life, came from watching my mother. My mother had always been the strong-willed, no-nonsense type. She was the kind of woman who didn't let anyone push her around. In many ways, I admired her for that. She had this unshakable resilience about her, a way of taking charge in any situation. But it came with a downside. One that I didn't fully understand until I was older. My mother's strength often manifested as harshness. Especially when things didn't go her way. I vividly remember being a child, trailing behind her through the aisles of supermarkets, department stores, and post offices, witnessing how she would interact with people. Whenever someone made a mistake, a cashier taking too long, a store clerk not knowing where to find something, my mother would be quick to correct them. Sometimes, it was just a stern comment or a frustrated sigh. Other times, it was a full-on lecture about how things should be done. Delivered with an air of superiority that made me cringe even as a kid. She wasn't always wrong. Sometimes, the service really was slow. Or the store clerk genuinely didn't know what they were doing. But there was something about the way my mother reacted that made it feel like it wasn't just about the mistakes. It was about control. It was as if the smallest inconvenience was an affront to her. Something she had to squash immediately to maintain her authority over the situation. I never questioned her back then. She was my mother, and as far as I knew, she was always right. But I do remember the discomfort I felt, standing there as a child, watching these small conflicts play out. I remember the way cashiers would look after my mother stormed off. Their faces flushed with embarrassment or frustration. And I remember feeling embarrassed too. Not just for them, but for myself, for being part of the scene. As I got older, I started to distance myself from that side of her. I told myself that I wouldn't be like her. That I would be more patient, more understanding. I wouldn't snap at people or make them feel small just because things didn't go exactly the way I wanted. But the truth is, we all carry pieces of our parents with us, whether we like it or not. I had spent so many years trying not to be like her that I hadn't realized I had been picking up some of her habits along the way. I might not have been as vocal or confrontational, but I had my moments, like the time I snapped at a colleague for not doing their job correctly. Or the impatience I felt bubbling up whenever things didn't go according to plan at work. Those were my mother's tendencies manifesting in me, whether I acknowledged it or not. And then there was the supermarket incident. The woman who had berated the cashier had triggered something in me. Something that reminded me of all those times I'd watched my mother criticize someone for making a mistake. In that moment, I had wanted to be the opposite of her. I wanted to defend the cashier, to be the voice of compassion instead of judgment. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my reaction was rooted in the same kind of impatience. I had judged the woman in line just as quickly and harshly as she had judged the cashier. That realization hit me hard. I'd always prided myself on being different from my mother. But maybe I wasn't as different as I thought. I had reacted to the woman's outburst not with understanding, but with the same need to control the situation, to assert my own sense of right and wrong. In my attempt to defend the cashier, I had become the very thing I was trying to avoid, someone who couldn't tolerate mistakes or perceived incompetence. I thought back to my teenage years. The times when my mother's criticisms weren't directed at strangers but at me. She wasn't a bad parent by any means. She loved me, and she showed it in her own way. But she had high standards. And she wasn't afraid to let me know when I fell short. I can't count the number of times I heard phrases like, "Why didn't you do it this way?" Or, "You need to be more careful." It was never enough to just try my best. I had to do it perfectly. Or at least better than I had done before. I carried that pressure with me into adulthood. Always trying to be the best at everything. Always trying to avoid mistakes. And when I did mess up, I was my own harshest critic. That internal voice, my mother's voice, really, was always there. Reminding me that I could have done better. Should have done better. The thing is, that pressure to be perfect doesn't just stay internal. It seeps into how you view others, too. When you hold yourself to an impossibly high standard, it's easy to start holding others to the same standard. You start to expect perfection from people around you, even in the smallest interactions, like a cashier scanning your groceries. And when they inevitably fall short, because no one is perfect, you react with frustration. It's not just about their mistake, it's about the larger fear that mistakes aren't acceptable. That imperfection is a failure. Sitting there, thinking about all of this, I realized just how deeply ingrained those beliefs were in me. I had spent years trying to unlearn my mother's impatience. her quick judgments. But the truth was, I hadn't fully succeeded. They were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I didn't want to be like that. I didn't want to let impatience and judgment define how I treated people. Especially not over something as small as a minor mistake at the checkout line. But change isn't easy, especially when the habits you're trying to break are the ones you've carried with you for your entire life. The only way to move forward, I realized, was to acknowledge those parts of myself and work to do better. I couldn't erase my mother's influence on me, but I could choose to react differently. I could choose patience, understanding, and compassion, even when it was hard. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson I needed to take from the supermarket incident. Not that I had stood up for the cashier, but that I still had a long way to go in standing up to the parts of myself that I wasn't proud of. In the days following the supermarket incident, I found myself reflecting more deeply on my own behaviors, especially how much of my reactions were shaped by the things I hadn't fully addressed within myself. It wasn't an easy realization to come to, but it felt like an essential step in understanding why that moment had affected me so deeply. I realized it wasn't just about the woman in the store, the teenage cashier, or even about standing up for someone in the heat of the moment. It was about how I wanted to navigate the world moving forward. I had always believed I was patient and considerate, but the truth was more complicated. I wasn't the type to explode in public like the woman in the supermarket. But that didn't mean I didn't harbor my own frustrations and judgments. They just took different forms, sometimes more subtle, but no less impactful. The incident made me realize that being right or justified in defending someone didn't necessarily make my actions flawless. I had been quick to judge, quick to label someone as the villain, without fully understanding the complexities of the situation. And isn't that what the woman in the store had done? In her mind, the cashier had been inefficient. And that inefficiency was an affront to her time. Her day. Maybe, in a way, I had done the same thing to the woman. I had labeled her as the problem, the embodiment of impatience and rudeness, without considering what might have driven her to that point. It made me start thinking about the other people in my life, the ones I judged quietly, without even realizing it. Colleagues, friends, family. How often had I been too quick to criticize someone for not meeting my expectations? How many times had I reacted with annoyance when someone made a mistake? Even if I didn't say it out loud? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that part of my personal growth would involve learning to truly practice empathy. Not just when it was convenient or when someone was clearly in the right, but even in situations where my instinct was to judge. That didn't mean excusing bad behavior or letting people walk all over me. But it did mean approaching situations with a bit more understanding and a lot less certainty about my own righteousness. The next time I went to the grocery store, I noticed something small but significant. I wasn't just rushing through my list and waiting in line, mentally preparing for the next task. I was more aware of the people around me, the woman who looked like she had a long day, the cashier who was managing the steady flow of customers with a quiet determination, the older gentleman behind me who was tapping his foot, clearly impatient but keeping it to himself. Everyone was living in their own world, carrying their own burdens. It's something we hear all the time, but I realized how rarely I truly internalized it. We all have bad days. We all have moments when the smallest inconvenience feels like the last straw. But those moments don't define us, they just reflect where we are in that specific sliver of time. It made me think about how easy it is to misinterpret others' actions. The woman in the supermarket had snapped at the cashier. Yes, but I didn't know her story. Was she dealing with something difficult at home? Was she facing financial strain or personal loss? Maybe she had been treated poorly all day and just needed someone to hear her, to recognize her frustration instead of judging her for it. Of course, that didn't excuse her behavior, but it did offer a more compassionate way of viewing the situation. With that shift in perspective, I found myself approaching the people in my life with more patience. At work, when a colleague sent me an email with a mistake, I paused before responding. I didn't react with my usual irritation, the kind that made me want to correct them immediately. Instead, I acknowledged that they were likely dealing with the same pressures and stresses that I was. It didn't cost me anything to be kind. This wasn't an overnight transformation. And I still had moments where I struggled to hold back my frustrations. But what mattered was that I was more conscious of it now. I was starting to notice the patterns within myself, the ways I fell into judgment or impatience, and how I could choose a different response. I also realized that practicing patience wasn't just about how I treated others, it was about how I treated myself. I had been holding onto a lot of internal criticism, the kind of self-talk that never allowed for mistakes, that never let me off the hook for not being perfect. That voice had always been there, a low hum in the background of my mind, telling me I wasn't good enough, wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't doing things the right way. But part of growth, part of truly moving forward, meant learning to silence that voice, or at least to stop letting it have so much power over me. I needed to extend the same empathy and patience to myself that I was trying to show others. I needed to allow myself room to be human, to make mistakes, and to know that those mistakes didn't define me. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. Once I let go of the need to always be right, always be perfect, I felt lighter. I wasn't carrying the weight of other people's expectations, or my own self-imposed ones, on my shoulders as much. I could breathe a little easier. The supermarket incident had shaken something loose in me, something that had needed to come to the surface for a long time. It wasn't about whether I had been justified in standing up for the cashier. It was about realizing that life is full of these moments. Moments when we have to decide how we want to show up, how we want to respond, and who we want to be. I didn't want to be the person who reacted out of frustration or judgment anymore. I wanted to be the person who chose empathy, who chose understanding, even when it wasn't easy. I wanted to be the person who took a step back before jumping to conclusions, who paused to consider the other person's perspective. And most of all, I wanted to be the person who could forgive herself for the times when she fell short. In the weeks that followed, I found myself revisiting that day in the supermarket less and less. It no longer felt like a moment of failure or doubt, but rather a turning point, a reminder that growth is messy, that we don't always get it right the first time, but that the important thing is to keep trying. We're all works in progress. After all,